Welcome to the first episode of this series on the American Civil War. We begin not with the first great battles, but with the long fuse, how slavery, westward expansion, and political invention pushed one nation toward fracture. This episode carries the story through secession in the Lower South and the creation of the Confederate States, stopping at the trapdoor of Fort Sumter, which we open in Episode 2. By the 1840s, the United States was a continental experiment committed, in words, to liberty, yet built in part on racial slavery. That contradiction was not a secret. It shaped law, culture, and elections. Understanding the war begins with admitting how normal, profitable, and defended human bondage had become in half the country, and how threatening its expansion looked to many voters in the other half. The cotton boom tied Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia planters to British textile mills and New York commission houses. Enslaved labor produced the crop, credit networks moved it. Wealth concentrated in hands that demanded political protection for slavery as a property system, while also seeking low tariffs and access to fresh Western soil when Eastern lands wore out. Congress banned the African slave trade in 1808, but internal commerce exploded. Upper South sellers shipped people south and southwest. Families were separated at auction blocks. Reformers used the trade's visibility to attack slavery's cruelty, while defenders insisted it was a private property right beyond federal meddling, a preview of constitutional arguments to come. Northern editors celebrated mobility, wages, and small farms as the engine of democracy. Southern essayists framed plantation paternalism and racial order as stability. Both societies changed fast with railroads and cities. Both told stories about independence. When those stories collided in Congress over territories, abstract ideals became votes and vetoes. Missouri's bid for statehood forced the question, would slavery cross the Mississippi? Maine entered free, Missouri entered slave. A line at 3630 was drawn across the Louisiana Purchase. The compromise bought time, but it also taught politicians that sectional bargains could be mapped, and that mapping would invite the next fight. Decades before secession ordinances, John C. Calhoun and others tested the limits of federal power with theories of state interposition. These ideas did not make the Civil War inevitable, yet they stocked the intellectual cupboard later, opened by secession commissioners, who claimed a reserved right to leave the Union when safety demanded it. William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator and the American Anti-Slavery Society demanded immediate emancipation and equal rights, radical in the 1830s. Most Northerners disliked slavery in the abstract, yet feared disruption. Still, petitions flooded Congress. Mail campaigns spread pamphlets. The moral temperature rose even where practical politics lagged. Nat Turner's 1831 revolt in Virginia terrified the plantation regime. In Richmond, some delegates whispered about gradual emancipation. The window closed. Afterward, many Southern states tightened black codes, restricted literacy, and policed movement, hardening the very system critics called a danger to public safety. American settlers broke from Mexico, partly over slavery's future under Mexican law. The Texas Republic flirted with Britain, alarming U.S. expansionists. Annexation in 1845 brought a giant new slave state, and a border dispute that made war with Mexico far more likely. President James K. Polk's administration maneuvered toward conflict. Armies marched to Mexico City. Whigs like Lincoln later called the war aggression. Volunteers still enlisted by the tens of thousands. Victory delivered a vast cession, exactly the prize that would detonate sectional politics. Pennsylvania Democrat David Wilmot attached a rider, "No slavery in lands taken from Mexico." It failed repeatedly, yet it reframed debate. Northerners asked why fellow citizens should shoulder blood and tax only to open fresh plantations. Southerners heard an assault on equality in the territories. The war's prize became a poisoned chalice. Gold Rush California surged in population and demanded government. Its draft constitution leaned free soil. Admitting it without a paired slave state upset the delicate balance Southerners believed the Missouri line had guaranteed. Clay, Webster, and others returned to the capital with bandages and ambition for one more grand bargain. Henry Clay stitched a deal. California entered free. New Mexico and Utah used popular sovereignty. Texas dropped a boundary claim for debt relief. The slave trade ended in the District of Columbia, and a new Fugitive Slave Act promised federal muscle for slaveholders reclaiming escapees. Passage required Stephen Douglas's parliamentary skill, and still satisfied almost no one fully. Federal commissioners could deputize citizens. Alleged fugitives faced limited due process. Penalties punished helpers. In Boston and elsewhere, crowds stormed courthouses. Ministers hid people in attics. Black communities organized vigilance lines toward Canada. Many who cared little for garrison now saw federal power enlisted against neighbors and resented it. Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 novel translated abolitionist themes into domestic melodrama. Whether readers treated it as documentary or fiction, it sold in astounding numbers and shaped foreign opinion. Defensive Southerners answered with counter-novels. The cultural trench between sections deepened even as politicians negotiated. The Pierce administration pursued expansion, Gadsden Purchase, filibustering fantasies in the Caribbean, while enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act angered northern cities. Kansas was about to replace California as the sectional lightning rod, and Stephen Douglas was preparing the match. In 1854, Douglas championed territorial bills that repealed the Missouri Compromise's ban north of 3630. Settlers, he argued, should decide slavery locally. Northern critics called it a betrayal. Southern editors cheered fair play. Both sides sent men and rifles to Kansas, turning doctrine into border war. Missouri border ruffians crossed to vote in territorial elections. Free state men organized alternative legislatures. Lawrence faced sacking. John Brown answered with night violence along Pottawatomie Creek. Washington politicians debated in language borrowed from massacres and arson, proof that territorial policy was no longer an abstract map exercise. Senator Sumner's crime against Kansas speech insulted a South Carolina cousin of Senator Andrew Butler. Representative Preston Brooks beat Sumner with a cane on the Senate floor. Southern admirers sent canes. Northern prints sold cartoons of aristocratic brutality. The caning showed how honor culture and sectional rage could turn debate into bodily assault. Anti-Nebraska fusion tickets coalesced into Republicans opposing slavery's expansion. They attracted ex-Whigs, Free Soilers, and some nativists uneasy with Democrats' Southern tilt. Not an abolitionist party outright, Republicans framed free soil as opportunity for white workers and farmers, a winning formula in many northern states. Enslaved plaintiff Dred Scott sued in Missouri courts, claiming freedom after residence in free jurisdictions. Appeals climbed to the Supreme Court. The nation's highest bench could have issued a narrow ruling. Chief Justice Roger Taney's majority chose breadth, with catastrophic political fallout. The court held Scott was not a citizen, that Congress could not ban slavery in territories, and that due process blocked banning slave property. Republicans called it a slave power coup. Some Northern Democrats squirmed. Douglas's popular sovereignty looked hollow if federal law barred exclusion anyway. President Buchanan pushed Congress to admit Kansas under a pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. Many Kansans boycotted. Douglas broke with the administration to demand a fair referendum. The fight split the Democratic Party at the worst possible moment, just as Lincoln re-entered national politics. Running for Stephen Douglas's Senate seat, Abraham Lincoln argued the nation could not endure permanently half slave and half free. Their debates drew crowds along the Illinois countryside. Douglas's Freeport doctrine tried to square popular sovereignty with Dred Scott. Lincoln pressed the moral and political inconsistency and lost the Senate race, yet won a national reputation. On October 16, 1859, John Brown seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to spark a slave insurrection. Marines under Colonel Robert E. Lee captured him. Northern literati saw a martyr, Southern militias drilled. The raid convinced many slaveholders that Republican victory would mean arson on the plantation doorstep. Democrats fractured. Southern radicals walked out in Charleston over a platform dispute. Stephen Douglas could not unify the party. Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge. A splinter group backed John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party. Republicans met in Chicago, needing a candidate acceptable to Pennsylvania and the Northwest. Republicans chose Lincoln on the third ballot. He carried every free state except New Jersey's split. He won not a single electoral vote in the slave states. Legally, it was a fair election. Psychologically, it read as sectional conquest. Fire eaters had promised disunion if a black Republican won. Now they moved. Special conventions, not legislatures alone, claimed sovereign authority. South Carolina's Secession Ordinance of December 20, 1860, declared the Union dissolved as far as the state was concerned. Celebrations in Charleston mixed champagne with artillery drills. Unionists despaired or fell silent. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas passed ordinances through January and February. Commissioners carried messages state to state, arguing safety, honor, and slavery's future inside a Republican-governed federation. Each document varied in tone, yet read together they leave little doubt that protecting slavery animated the Revolution. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas refused immediate secession. Their economies mixed. Unionist sentiment ran strong in the mountains and valleys. Leaders demanded concessions or time, an opening for compromise proposals that would fail because neither side trusted the other's guarantees. Delegates from the seceded states drafted a provisional constitution modeled on the U.S. Text with slavery explicitly protected. They chose Montgomery, Alabama as capital. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi became provisional president. Alexander Stephens of Georgia, vice president. They insisted they acted from necessity, not whim. A West Point graduate, Mexican war hero and former U.S. Secretary of War, Davis brought bureaucratic experience. He also brought brittle health and a cold public manner. Confederates needed rapid diplomacy, finance, and military organization. Davis would try to build a nation while sovereignty was still contested bayonet by bayonet. Stevens told an audience the Confederacy's foundations rested on the truth that slavery subordination was the natural condition of black people. Modern apologists sometimes downplay the speech. Primary sources show Confederate leaders publicly framed their state as a corrective to Northern equality rhetoric, not merely a defense of abstract states' rights. U.S. Army posts, arsenals, and revenue cutters dotted the seceded states. Who owned them? Buchanan's administration wobbled. Secretary of War Floyd resigned amid scandal. Some arsenals surrendered, others held. Major Robert Anderson consolidated his garrison on an island fort in Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter. President James Buchanan condemned secession as unconstitutional yet hesitated to coerce states. He sent the Star of the West with supplies, batteries fired, the ship turned back. Republicans called timidity treason to the flag. Southerners saw any reinforcement as aggression. Anderson's men rationed food, while Charlestonians trained guns on their walls. Kentucky Senator John J. Crittenden proposed extending the Missouri line to the Pacific and entrenching it in the Constitution. Republicans rejected permanent guarantees for slavery's expansion. Southern radicals rejected anything short of independence. The compromise that might have worked in 1850 now drowned in mutual suspicion. President-elect Lincoln traveled east through cheering crowds and whispered plots. He kept counsel, issuing careful statements to avoid inflaming Charleston while refusing to abandon Republican platform commitments. His silence frustrated editors on all sides. It also denied fire eaters a pretext until policy had to become deed. Standing on the Capitol steps, Lincoln declared secession lawless, pledged not to interfere with slavery where it existed, and vowed to hold federal property. The speech tried to reassure the Upper South, while signaling Sumter would not be abandoned without a decision. Confederates heard a threat dressed as moderation. Lincoln's advisors split. Seward hinted at evacuating Sumter to buy time. Others argued surrender would doom the administration before it began. War Secretary Cameron, naval officers, and maps of Charleston Harbor filled late-night sessions. Every choice carried risk of peace or war. P. G. T. Beauregard recently resigned from the U.S. Army commanded Confederate batteries ringing the harbor. He knew Sumter's masonry and angles from old engineering notebooks. Diplomats still floated informal talks. Gunners practiced ranging shots. The fort's defenders watched sandbag lines rise on shore. Major Anderson's small U.S. force repaired embrasures, rotated drills, and counted hardtack. Morale mixed duty with dread. Mails brought newspapers calling them heroes or hostages depending on the masthead. Medical supplies ran short. Engineers worried which walls would splinter first. The Lincoln administration prepared a naval attempt to reprovision Sumter. Confederate leaders decided permitting resupply meant yielding sovereignty in their chief port. They demanded surrender. Anderson refused. Negotiation narrowed to hours. The question was no longer if Charleston would flash, but when, and who would appear to have fired the first shot. Manifest Destiny was more than a slogan. It was a program of settlement, removal, and war. Native nations faced displacement. Mexican sovereignty collapsed at gunpoint. Each acquisition reopened the question of whether slavery would follow the flag, a question Congress could not permanently bury. Letting settlers vote on slavery sounded democratic. On the ground, it meant fraud, intimidation, and competing governments. Douglas believed process could harmonize sections. Kansas proved process could arm them. Democracy and violence intertwined on the prairie. Editors reprinted rumors as facts. Cartoons caricatured distant voters. Speed of information outran accuracy, much like later eras. Readers in Maine and Mississippi encountered different Americas on the same date line, a fractured public sphere before the first telegraphed battle report. Irish and German newcomers crowded eastern cities and northwest farms. Their cheap labor undercut artisans, yet also feared competition with free black workers. Nativist parties flickered, then many flowed into anti-Nebraska coalitions. Ethnic politics complicated simple maps of good and evil. Steam-powered gins, railroad spurs to levees, and accounting ledgers made slavery more productive, not anachronistic. Modern efficiency deepened dependence on bondage. Reform became more costly to elites. Economic dynamism and moral critique collided in the same cotton fields. Charleston, Richmond, and New Orleans housed hired-out workers, skilled enslaved artisans, and domestic labor in townhouses. Slavery was not only a rural institution. Urban complexities shaped how escape networks operated and how patrols policed streets, facts that complicated romantic myths of moonlight and magnolias. Women organized anti-slavery fairs, signed petitions, and in some cases spoke publicly despite convention. Southern mistresses managed plantation labor regimes. Diaries reveal complicity and occasional unease. Gender norms constrained power, yet women influenced the moral whether long before they could vote. Methodists and Baptists split North and South over slavery and eldership. Churches were social networks as much as theology clubs. Rupture in the pews prefigured rupture in polities. Each side claimed God's favor. Wartime sermons would baptize carnage with providence. Polygenesis and skull measuring, fraud lent false comfort to racial hierarchy. Serious ethnology mixed with quackery, politicians quoted both. Such ideas did not create slavery, yet they hardened defenses and slowed moral reckoning among voters who wanted nature to excuse injustice. Abolitionists mailed pamphlets south. Jacksonian Democrats imposed gag rules to table anti-slavery petitions. The fight over speech and deliberation in the House foreshadowed later arguments about censorship and safety, proving Congress could inflame while pretending to quiet debate. Private armies eyed Cuba and Central America for new slave frontiers. Most expeditions failed. All advertised restless expansionism. They showed how some Southerners imagined solving sectional stress through foreign conquest rather than domestic reform. Texas entered with rumors of enormous debt and uncertain borders. Compromised trades swapped territory for federal assumption of liabilities. Such horse trading looked technical. It moved lines on maps that determined whether slavery's culture could spread west. States like Massachusetts and Wisconsin passed statutes limiting state cooperation with slave catchers. Southerners cried breach of comity, Northerners cited conscience. The legal conflict foreshadowed wartime suspensions and Reconstruction clashes over federal versus state power. In 1854, federal officers marched a fugitive named Anthony Burns to a ship amid troops, bayonets, and weeping crowds. The price tag of one return shocked taxpayers. Such scenes recruited men to the Republican column who would never attend an abolitionist lecture. Topeka and Lecompton rivals both claimed legitimacy. Washington had to pick or delay. Buchanan's choice alienated Douglas and Midwestern Democrats. Kansas became a classroom in how not to organize a territory, and a warning that popular sovereignty required trust the sections no longer had. Volunteer companies drilled in town squares, ladies sewed banners, editors published rosters. The pageantry looked like peacekeeping, yet prepared for war. When orders came to mobilize, communities already knew their companies, names, and captains. British mills needed cotton. British liberals abhorred slavery. Palmerston's government calculated neutrality's profits and risks. Confederates hoped for recognition. Union diplomats worked to frame secession as rebellion. Episode 1 ends before foreign guns sail. The chessboard is set. News traveled along wharves and kitchens. Lincoln's victory meant uncertainty. Some planters tightened patrols. Others debated selling human property before prices shook. In the Chesapeake, escape attempts ticked upward. People in bondage were not passive spectators. They calculated futures with courage the documents rarely credited. Northern black leaders met in churches and halls, demanding citizenship and arms if war came. They remembered Crispus Attucks and the Revolution. They knew compromise politics excluded them. Their organizing would later pressure the Union toward emancipation, though that story belongs to later episodes. Cherokee Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole communities held complex loyalties after removal. Some elites held enslaved people. Alliances split between Union and Confederate agents, offering protection and threats. The Civil War was continental. Indigenous diplomacy shaped borderlands far from Richmond. Postmasters, marshals, and revenue officers symbolized federal presence. Seizing customs houses funded Confederate ambition. Losing them starved Washington of Southern fees. Bureaucratic politics mattered as much as oratory. Who could sign a paycheck? Who could impound a ship? Iron tracks moved troops and grain. Copper wires carried rumors faster than horses. Both sides would fight for bridges and cut lines. Technology did not make war humane. It compressed decision cycles and spread panic with efficiency. Oystermen, market women, and enslaved dockworkers kept the city fed while batteries rose. Blockade talk already circulated in taverns. Merchants priced risk into rice and salt pork. Siege economics began before the first naval cordon. Matthew Brady's gallery displayed Lincoln's angular frame. Cartes de visite spread faces of generals yet unnamed. Visual culture helped citizens imagine leaders they might never meet and would soon mourn. Punchy cartoons mocked rival sections. Laughter vented fear. Satire could not stop secession, yet it recorded how ordinary readers processed absurdity, brothers threatening brothers while sharing a language. Volunteer firemen doubled as political clubs. Riots sometimes started at hydrants. Maintaining order in cities like Baltimore or St. Louis would test mayors when regiments marched through streets of mixed loyalty. Blackface minstrelsy dominated popular stages, spreading racist caricature even where audiences opposed slavery. Spirituals and hymns carried, coded hope in fields and churches. Soundscapes of the era remind us culture war preceded declared war. Campaign seasons followed roads drying in spring. Mud stalled spring offensives later in the war. In 1861, generals still guessed timetables by farm almanacs. Climate shaped strategy as surely as maps. Another reason Episode 2's opening moves waited on tides and wind. Children traced states and territories on slates. Textbook publishers chose colors for slave and free. Education planted identity early, which flag to salute, which heroes to memorize. The generation that fought had learned geography tinged with politics. Columned courthouses anchored county seats, where volunteers enlisted and provost guards later tried deserters. Neoclassical facades claimed Republican virtue even as dockets listed human property. Built environment mirrored contradictions words alone could not resolve. Charleston pilots knew channels Anderson's bluejackets studied on charts. Local knowledge favored defenders. Union captains would learn at cost. Sumter's fight begins as a problem of tides, anchors, and pilot boats, details easy to forget beneath the smoke. Palmetto flags sprouted alongside stars and stripes. Militia companies sewed silk mottos. Symbolic claims over forts mattered, because flags read as sovereignty visible at a glance. Who raised which cloth over Sumter would echo in recruiting posters within days. Tredegar and smaller shops cast shot and shell. Inventories decided how long a bombardment could continue. Industrial capacity would eventually favor the Union. In spring 1861, both sides still believed a short, decisive contest possible. Army surgeons packed lint and bone saws. They knew little of antisepsis. Peacetime Army medicine was thin. Wartime would explode caseloads. The Sumter garrison's real risk after food was infection from any wound. Another reason relief seemed urgent to humane officers. Third system fortresses absorbed iron shot better than timber walls, yet brick cracked under sustained fire. Engineers debated angles and magazines. Gunners tested ranges with practice rounds. Fort Sumter was a technology duel, as well as a political crisis. Wigwag and naval signal flags carried orders across noisy harbors. Misread banners could waste ammunition or friendly lives. Communication discipline would separate competent commands from chaos, starting with the first harbor exchange of fire. Soldiers enlisted for monthly dollars. Government scrambled for specie. Financial markets watched Charleston tension. Treasury officials feared runs. Money and morale intertwined. An army unpaid is an army that melts, as both sides would learn. Neither side yet imagined Andersonville. Still, planners scanned warehouses and ships for holding space. The legal status of captives hovered between criminals and soldiers of a rival nation. Sumter's fate would force definitions long deferred. Beacons marked entrances pilots needed. Extinguishing or guarding lights became petty strategy. Night operations relied on moon phase and lantern discipline. Episode 2's opening scenes mix black powder flash with pale surf on sandbars, signals in darkness. Underwriters priced policies on Gulf and Atlantic routes. Rumors of war raised premiums overnight. Commerce tied regions that politics tore apart. Neutral flags would soon test blockade law, but first came the harbor's warning shot. Newspapermen telegraphed every Anderson dispatch. Typesetters worked past midnight. Readers would wake to headlines that aged by breakfast. Modern war began not only with cannon, but with column inches racing public opinion toward commitment. Boys skipped school to watch steamers and militia. Girls folded bandages in anticipation. Childhood memory would carry these harbor days for decades. War's social history starts in curiosity and fear long before enlistment ages. Whigs fractured over slavery and nativism. Know-nothings peaked then faded. When stable two-party competition dissolved, voters faced sharper binary choices. Republicans versus Democrats mapped more cleanly onto sectional lines than older Jacksonian coalitions ever had. Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri traded up and down rivers with both sections. Their elites feared coercion from either side. Their wavering would shape Union strategy and Confederate dreams of a horizontal cotton empire across the South. Congressmen roomed together across party lines in earlier decades. By the late 50s, sectional blocs ate separately and trusted less. Personal friendships that once softened votes thinned out. Another small reason compromise drafts died in committee. Presidents rewarded allies with ports and posts. Lincoln's appointments would signal whether he sought conciliation or firmness. Every signature on a commission stirred editors who read patronage as policy. Formal duels faded. Canes on the Senate floor did not. Honor culture adapted to chambers and streets. Violence moved from private codes to public spectacle, training audiences for worse to come. Paddle wheels moved cotton to New Orleans and immigrants up the Mississippi. Control of rivers later meant campaigns and sieges. In the Secession winter, they meant news packets and rumor traveling faster than cavalry. French Creole culture, Irish labor, and American planters mingled at the Mississippi's mouth. Louisiana's secession debate mixed Caribbean trade fears with sugar slavery's distinct interests, reminding us the Confederacy was never culturally uniform. Texas seceded February 1, 1861, but Unionist Governor Sam Houston resisted mobilization and paid with his office. Lone Star distance from Richmond foreshadowed supply headaches for any Southern Confederation. Robert Toombs and Howell Cobb maneuvered Georgia from caution to commitment. Atlanta's railroad hub made the state strategically priceless. Once Georgia left, the lower South's belt looked contiguous on the map. William Lowndes Yancey and others had preached disunion for years. When Lincoln won, they claimed vindication. Their rhetoric narrowed options for moderates who might have preferred a negotiated pause. Mississippi's January 9th secession framed continuity with revolutionary tradition, even as it defended slavery explicitly. Jefferson Davis left the Senate with a farewell that sounded more sorrow than joy, a tone some mistook for reluctance. Sparse population but long seaboard made Florida valuable for blockade thinking and inland cattle drives. Secession there mattered to naval planners, imagining Gulf patrols and river mouths. New Orleans houses held deposits tied to cotton factors. Financial panic could starve planters and governments alike. Confederate treasurers soon learned paper promises. Without trade meant inflation before the first major battle. Springfield and Harper's Ferry patterns armed state militias. Raids and seizures redistributed stocks. Everyone knew industrial North outproduced South in muskets, another argument for striking early or seeking foreign arms. Companies wore whatever tailors supplied: blue wool, cadet gray, hunting clothes. Only later did dye lots convert. toward Confederate gray and Union blue. Episode 1 ends while colors still clashed in chaotic company streets. Brass bands marched volunteers to rail depots. Sentimental ballads sold sheet music within weeks of events. Music stiffened spines and masked dread. It also commodified suffering almost instantly. Wagons, mules, and teamsters decided how fast an army consumed food. Pre-war quartermaster corps were tiny. Improvisation ruled. Logistics would humble romantic cavalry charges. First lesson learned in the mobilization weeks after Sumter. West Pointers studied French strategic theory. Amateurs read popular histories of Napoleon. Doctrine emphasized interior lines and decisive battle, expectations that would crash against American distances and rifle ranges. Engineers debated casemates versus barbette guns. Rodman smoothbores outranged older pieces. Sumter's parapets were thick, but not infinite. Confederate batteries on higher ground held angles Anderson feared. Sidewheel steamers could run supplies if guns allowed. Sailing ships depended on wind. Union planners sketched convoys. Confederate pickets watched every smokestack. Harbor geography turned naval technology into chess. April nights on the Atlantic coast mixed damp and murk. Tidal currents tug anchors. Episode 2's chronology turns on whether boats could land flour and cartridges under fire. Details professionals sweated while politicians speechified. Charlestonians expected a show. Some landlords charged for roof seats. Tourism and treason mingled uncomfortably. When guns spoke, spectators learned war stains more than sky. Impressed hands dug batteries and moved earth. Promises of freedom were rare and grudging. Black sweat shielded a regime built on bondage, irony visible to anyone who chose to look. The fleet was scattered, ships rotting in ordinary. Gideon Wells would expand it, but in March 1861 numbers misled. Few vessels could fight or blockade effectively without refit. Sumter's crisis arrived before blue water supremacy did. Adjutant General, Quartermaster, Commissary, Medical, Ordnance, each bureau jealous of turf. Confederates copied the structure, then struggled with duplication and corruption. Institutions mattered as much as eloquence in sustaining armies. Both sides imagined a short war. Initial enlistments often ran 90 days. Politicians promised mothers' sons home by harvest. Sumter's echo would stretch those terms into years, a betrayal of expectations that fueled draft riots later. Montgomery was provisional. Rumors already whispered Richmond. Moving government closer to Virginia's manpower meant proximity to danger as well. Geography and politics intertwined for Davis's cabinet. Cutting federal mail south of Washington tested information flow. Newspapers arrived late, crossed out, or smuggled. Citizens guessed at policy from fragments, fertile ground for panic. Stephen Douglas campaigned for the Union after losing to Lincoln. Other Northern Democrats split between war when fired upon and local compromise. Their choices after Sumter would decide whether the Upper South saw the North as one fist or a fractured crowd. Britain imported grain from the Union Northwest, as well as fiber from the South. King Cotton diplomacy was never a simple stranglehold. Episode 1 closes before ministers gamble on recognition, but the economic chess pieces were already on the board. Cholera and typhoid stalked barracks and slums. Army camps magnified filth. Medical officers copied pre-war regimens inadequate for mass armies. Public health would become a hidden casualty list. Secessionists framed reinforcement as coercion. Unionists cited federal property rights. Legal language tried to dress power in principle. When shooting started, briefs mattered less than powder. We have traced slavery's power, failed compromises, the rise of the Republicans, John Brown's shock, Lincoln's election, secession, and the Confederate government's first weeks. The armies have not yet settled into the long grind of camps and casualties. The opening roar of Sumter is seconds away on the historical clock. We leave Anderson's flag flying above the fort, Confederate batteries trained inward, and Lincoln's cabinet committed to resupply rather than quiet surrender. Episode 2 opens with the bombardment, Lincoln's proclamation for volunteers, and the Upper South's fateful choice, when diary pages and harbor clocks met linstocks, fuses, and headlines that could not be called back. If this long fuse helped you see how war became thinkable before the first great battles, share the episode and save the playlist. Primary documents, from secession ordinances to Lincoln's inaugural, reward anyone who reads them alongside the narrative. We will see you at Sumter.